We'll begin our series talking about APIs. We'll talk about what they are, why they're important, and how they're used. Now, to begin talking about what they are, it's important to know that an API is a base level for external access to a piece of infrastructure or an application. This gives us the opportunity to control that component and control the features of it through remote calls. Now, an API typically is on the public-facing end that we can then send calls to. An API is a base level for providing external access to the piece of infrastructure or an application. APIs are leveraged by numerous technologies in order to change that infrastructure or change that application based on the needs. Many of our common tools that we use on the web, like if you think about Twitter, Facebook, they all have APIs that allow developers to change or to collect information in that environment. From an infrastructure standpoint, we use APIs to enable other integrations and enable the interaction of the infrastructure in the tool sets that we use, as we'll go in through the rest of this video. One thing to keep in mind is that APIs are built in multiple different ways. If you look across the IT industry, the most common that you see and most common that you hear about are REST, JSON RPC, SOAP, and XML. Different vendors use different APIs. Sometimes it's because of the way the platform was built. Sometimes it's because it's just what they chose to use. But regardless, an API is the method for interfacing with that piece of infrastructure without having to use the CLI or the provided graphical user interface. The last thing to note is that APIs don't discriminate. All they care about is that the call is made correctly, as you'll see in the upcoming demonstration. You make the right call and it'll do what you tell it to do. And that's all there is to it. I touched on it briefly, but let's talk a little bit about why APIs are really important. APIs are providing external access to the system. APIs provide discrete steps that you can execute against the system. So, as we'll see in an upcoming demonstration, if you wanted to create a volume, there are API calls or methods that know how to create a volume. Many platforms are actually built leveraging APIs. So the APIs provide opportunities to externally manage that system, and it allows you to execute the steps that you need. And these may be steps that are not native into the user interface or a CLI. APIs also serve as a fundamental integration point for software development kits, or SDKs. SDKs extend the capabilities, and as we get into in just a moment, you'll see that they make it much easier to interact with the system. Because while APIs are very important, they're not always friendly to interact with. Finally, APIs allow us to create services against the platforms that we use. So if we have an application and we need the platform to change, let's say we need to change the snapshot schedule for some volumes, or we need to change accounts or the performance characteristics of a volume, we can actually roll that into the tool sets that we're already using. APIs enable that capability. In that demo, you saw an opportunity where we managed a SolidFire system, creating a volume using Postman. Postman is a tool where you can create the call that you want to make to an API, store it, run it, and see the result. The result we see in that video is an ID, which is a volume ID. Now, when we talk about the usefulness of having a volume ID, it's most important to be able to find out more information about the volume. What we really probably need is information about the volume. The API gives us an opportunity to make that call separately. So we would create the volume, get an ID return, and then turn around and ask for information about that volume using the volume ID. This works. It can happen anywhere in the environment, whatever you're trying to do, but it requires additional steps. There really needs to be a better way. This is where SDKs come into play. Software development kits enable us to interact with an API a little bit more effectively. The API, while all the steps are possible, isn't necessarily convenient. Software development kits then step in and provide that interaction through a language of choice. SDKs are often delivered in numerous different types of languages, such as Java or Python, C#. Different ecosystems and different preferences dictate what SDKs we need and what SDKs people may use. SDKs reduce the amount of code that's required in order to perform steps. Additional logic can be included in the SDK and then applied. For instance, you can create the volume and in your application have it automatically return the volume information, not needing to perform every individual discrete step. These steps can be consolidated. We can also use an SDK in order to simplify what type of data needs to be passed in to the call. Where APIs are very strict, software development kits can provide a little looseness, if you will, and make it easier to interact with the API and the infrastructure. One other advantage of an SDK is you don't have to understand the API protocol. That's abstracted from you. If you know Python, all you need to know is Python. You can look at the SDK that's being provided for the piece of infrastructure, understand the call that you're trying to make, and use the language of your choice. SDKs provide a faster path to accomplishing your goals, using the language of choice and implementing it into platforms that you already use. It also enables the building of larger integrations that provide even easier access to the infrastructure, which we'll touch on in the next section. In this demo, we'll show you an example of using one of the SDKs to take care of a common task and integrate it directly into an application. In that demo, you saw one of our SDKs in action. We were able to execute change against one of the volumes and be able to include that in an overall larger application scope. So as you see, SDKs are built on APIs. APIs extend the capabilities of the infrastructure. Next, we're going to talk about integrations. Integrations are where we extend the capabilities of the infrastructure, leveraging our APIs and our SDKs, and put them into common tool sets that people use every day in their data centers. As a great example, PowerShell is very pervasive throughout our industry, and leveraging our SDKs, we are able to build PowerShell modules that can be used by our customers and by you. One thing that you'll note is in the industry, there's a lot of diversity in the platforms that we use to manage our data centers. SDKs enable us to create integrations for those different platforms. Using an SDK, we're able to create that integration much more quickly and more efficiently than if we were trying to make direct API calls, even though those direct API calls are still an option in a lot of platforms. These integrations simply make things easier to manage, easier to consume, easier to operate. Additionally, this level of abstraction and being able to use the tools that you're familiar with means that you don't have to understand everything that's happening on the underlying system. You simply need to understand how to execute the request. Everything else is done for you through the SDKs, through the APIs. Finally, integrations means that you can have direct access to the infrastructure through the platforms that you're already using, whether it's a plugin for the vSphere client or it's native integration with Cinder for OpenStack or the Docker Volume plugin. This means that implementing infrastructure and managing it can happen right in the tool that you're using as you're using it. No need to go out to a separate user interface, CLI, or another person. You can handle it right there where you're working. In this demo video, we'll show you using the PowerShell module to accomplish the same task that you saw with the API and the SDK demos. Except for this time, you don't have to know all the constructs. You simply have to know what you want to accomplish, and it executes it. Better returns, better experience. As you look across the different layers that we've talked about, APIs, SDKs, and integrations, what you'll find is that as you move up the stack, the amount of effort that's required to perform tasks becomes less. The amount of onus for you to understand what's going on in the underlying system becomes less. But what's important to know is that your capabilities and the power to consume and manage increase. And that's fundamentally what you're looking for. And that is why it's important to understand how APIs, SDKs, and integrations all work together and tie in to the infrastructure components that we manage. In summary, APIs and SDKs allow us to extend the capabilities of the infrastructure, perform tasks and do things that we need to do that may not be native to the platforms that are provided to us for managing the platforms. Integrations provide us the opportunity to extend the capability and management directly in the tools that we already use every single day. Thank you for watching the first video in our bartending series. If you have any suggestions or want to provide some feedback on topics for upcoming videos, reach out to us at the pub, netapp.io. Join us in the Slack team, or you can follow us on Twitter @NetAppPub.